I got a letter from the HOA claiming I owed thousands of dollars in fees for a property I've never even lived in. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but then the threats started piling up, lawyers calling, notices posted, and suddenly my life felt like it was being torn apart over something that wasn't even mine. How could an organization have so much power over a place I never touched, never rented, never owned? And when I finally stepped into the courtroom, I realized this was about more than money. It was about standing up to a system that thought it could bully anyone, anywhere. But could I really fight back and win? Before any of the chaos began, my life was simple, almost idyllic. I had spent years moving from city to city, chasing opportunities, but when I finally stumbled across a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood with well-kept lawns and friendly neighbors, I felt like I'd finally found a place to breathe. The small, unassuming house I rented, or at least thought I did, was tucked behind flowering dogwoods, with a modest porch that caught the morning sun just right, and a backyard that felt like a hidden retreat from the world. My days were predictable, but comforting: morning coffee on the porch, walks to the corner store where everyone knew your name, evenings spent reading or tinkering in my little garden. The community itself had the kind of rules that felt normal, the sort that made life orderly without ever feeling oppressive, and for a moment, it felt like I could finally settle. Even though I hadn't bought the place myself, that quiet, steady rhythm was about to be shattered. There had been whispers, minor complaints about fees or assessments in the neighborhood newsletter, almost invisible notes in the mailboxes, things that seemed inconsequential, almost bureaucratic. No one really paid attention. But for me, they were the first inkling that something in this seemingly peaceful neighborhood could turn into a nightmare, that the organization claiming to protect the community had the power to disrupt lives. Even mine, despite the fact that I hadn't officially been on their radar at all. Little did I know, what started as a small administrative notice would escalate into a fight that challenged everything I thought I knew about property, fairness, and standing up for myself. From the moment that first official-looking letter slipped through my mailbox, everything I thought I knew about my quiet little neighborhood began to unravel. The notice was short, bureaucratic, and completely baffling. A demand for hundreds of dollars in fees for a property I had never even officially owned. Fines that supposedly accumulated over months. I hadn't even lived there, and vague accusations of violations that made no sense to anyone with half a brain. At first, I thought it must be a clerical error, a simple mistake that could be cleared up with a phone call. But when I tried to contact the HOA, the lines went unanswered, emails vanished into cyberspace, and any letter I sent received nothing but a generic, dismissive form response. It became increasingly clear that this wasn't about rules or community standards. It was about power, control, and intimidation. Suddenly, the peaceful walk to the corner store felt like traversing a minefield, because rumors were already circulating about the problem tenant who hadn't paid her dues. One neighbor, who had seemed friendly weeks before, now looked at me with a combination of suspicion and fear, as though they had been warned about me behind closed doors. Every week brought a new letter, another phantom fine, another violation that was impossible to verify, and the sense of suffocation tightened like a vice around my life. I started noticing small things in my yard, a stake knocked over that I was certain hadn't been moved. Strange figures lingering near the edge of my property, someone taking photos of my mailbox. It was harassment, pure and simple, and it wasn't subtle. I began documenting everything: photos, notes, timestamps, every interaction, every letter, every suspicious encounter. Still, the HOA's tactics escalated. A certified notice threatening legal action if I didn't pay immediately. Insinuations that I could be taken to court. And even a letter implying that my personal belongings could be seized. I couldn't believe this was happening. I hadn't even purchased the house officially, yet I was being dragged into a war I never asked for. As I dug deeper, I discovered that the HOA was operating in a gray area, exploiting loopholes and bending rules, twisting bureaucracy into a weapon to intimidate residents, and in my case, a total stranger. Each new notice, each new encounter, piled on more anxiety, but also fueled a determination I hadn't known I possessed. I realized I wasn't going to be pushed around, ignored, or bullied into paying for something that was never mine. Every day became a strategic game. Anticipating the next move, preparing for the worst, staying one step ahead while still trying to keep my sanity. There were late-night research sessions, conversations with legal advisors, and frantic phone calls to neighbors who had also experienced the HOA's questionable tactics. Slowly, I pieced together a pattern, a method to the madness, and began crafting my own counter-strategy. Then one morning, I received a particularly aggressive letter claiming that if the fees weren't paid within 48 hours, they would take my rightful property into their own hands. That's when I realized the escalation had reached a dangerous threshold. This was no longer just a bureaucratic headache. It was an all-out assault on my rights, my reputation, and my life as a member of this community. Heart-pounding, I knew I had to act decisively. I began reaching out to former residents, gathering evidence of similar abuses, and even tracking discrepancies in the HOA's own records. Each revelation was more infuriating than the last accounts that didn't exist. Properties claimed as unpaid for years, fees that had been assessed retroactively without notice. With each new discovery, my resolve strengthened. I could feel the tension building like a storm about to break. The community I had admired for its peace and tranquility had a dark undercurrent, a network of power that preyed on the unwary. And yet, within that darkness, I found clarity. If I wanted justice, I had to confront the system head-on, gather undeniable proof, and be ready for the moment when the facade would crumble. The days blurred together in a mix of anxiety, vigilance, and preparation, each moment bringing me closer to the inevitable confrontation. Finally, after weeks of meticulous planning and collecting documentation, I was poised to challenge them, not just on paper, but in a way that would expose their patterns, their intimidation tactics, and their abuse of authority. The tension was palpable. Every creak in the house, every passerby glancing at my property, reminded me that this wasn't a game. It was a battle for truth and justice. And just as I thought I was prepared for anything, a new letter arrived, stamped and certified, with language so brazen it was almost comical if it weren't so infuriating. They claimed to have proof of violations, fees owed, and authority to take immediate action. I stared at the envelope, realizing that everything was about to come to a head, that the moment of reckoning I had been preparing for had arrived. There was no turning back, no quiet resolution. The next steps I took would determine whether I was crushed by their arbitrary power, or whether I could finally stand up, fight back, and expose the truth for everyone to see. The storm I had been bracing for was here, and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning the confrontation began, I felt a mixture of dread and adrenaline pulsing through me like electricity, because everything I had been preparing for, the documentation, The witness statements, the evidence of the HOA's fabricated fees and illegal harassment, was about to be unleashed in a single, undeniable strike. As I walked into the community office, the atmosphere was thick with tension, the air seemed almost to hum with anticipation, and I could see the subtle glances exchanged between board members, a flicker of doubt in their eyes that hadn't been there before. They tried their usual tactics immediately: bureaucratic bluster, vague accusations, and the kind of condescending language meant to intimidate. But this time, I was ready. I calmly laid out the evidence, item by item, date by date, showing fees that didn't exist, violations that had never been recorded in any official log, and notices sent to addresses I had never even lived at. The room grew quiet as I methodically dismantled every claim they had made, their confident smirks fading into whispers of panic. I could feel the power shift subtly in the room, the scales tipping from fear to control, as the board realized that their usual tactics would not work against someone armed with irrefutable proof. Then came the bombshell. I presented correspondence that showed one of the board members had personally signed off on fabricated claims and falsified documents, essentially implicating themselves in potential fraud. The color drained from their faces, and for a moment, they froze, unsure whether to respond or retreat, because the gravity of the evidence left them trapped. My heart pounded, and my pulse raced as I felt the culmination of weeks of anxiety, research, and planning finally manifest into this moment of vindication. Every time they attempted to interrupt, I countered with facts, receipts, and sworn affidavits, exposing the intricate web of deception they had spun. Neighbors who had previously avoided involvement now peeked in, whispers spreading through the office like wildfire as everyone realized that the confrontation wasn't just about me. It was about the truth being revealed. The tension was almost unbearable as one board member tried to regain control, raising their voice, attempting to assert authority. But each assertion crumbled under the weight of proof, their threats now hollow echoes. The pivotal moment came when I unveiled the certified letters proving the immediate legal action. Threats had been fabricated, leaving no room for doubt about the illegitimacy of their claims. The room was silent except for the sound of paper shuffling, each page I laid down stripping away another layer of their intimidation. For the first time, I felt an undeniable sense of power, a mix of relief and righteous fury. As the reality sank in, I was no longer the victim. They were exposed. And just when it seemed they might attempt some desperate maneuver, I revealed the final piece of evidence, an official ruling from the county confirming that any fees claimed against me were void, illegal, and unenforceable, effectively turning their entire operation against them and making any further harassment a personal liability. You could almost feel the collective shock, the disbelief radiating off the board as the weight of legal authority settled over the room like a hammer. It was a turning point, not just for me, but for the community as a whole. The facade of unchecked power had crumbled in one decisive strike, leaving nothing but truth and accountability in its wake. As I gathered my evidence and prepared to leave, the board members sat frozen, their usual confidence replaced with stunned silence, and I realized that the story had shifted irrevocably. What had begun as harassment and intimidation had ended with undeniable justice. Yet the question lingered in the air. How far would they go next? And what would be the fallout once this exposure spread beyond the walls of the office? In the days and weeks that followed the courtroom showdown, the consequences of the HOA's actions, and my decisive exposure of their misconduct, rippled outward in ways that no one could have fully predicted, leaving a mix of vindication, relief, and a deeper understanding of how fragile, unchecked authority can be. The immediate aftermath was electric. As neighbors who had long whispered about petty harassment and unfair fines began to approach me with cautious congratulations, their curiosity finally tempered by the reality that the board's threats were empty, that the system could, in fact, be held accountable when confronted with evidence and perseverance, and I felt a profound sense of responsibility settle over me, not only for myself but for everyone in the community who had silently endured years of bureaucratic bullying and intimidation, wondering if anyone would ever stand up. The HOA, once confident in its ability to manipulate and instill fear, now faced legal scrutiny, with official investigations initiated by the county into their practices, including potential fraud and unauthorized imposition of fees. And the psychological toll on the board was evident. Members who had once wielded power as a weapon now hesitated to speak. Their every word weighed against the undeniable documentation I had presented, realizing that their attempts to maintain control had backfired spectacularly, and the ripple effect extended beyond mere intimidation, as local media outlets picked up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale of what happens when small, insular governing bodies overstep their authority, which in turn encouraged other residents in neighboring communities to challenge unjust rules and fees, emboldening those who had previously felt powerless. And I watched as the dynamics of our neighborhood shifted almost overnight, with transparency becoming a rallying point. Meetings that had once been procedural exercises in rubber stamping board decisions, now transforming into forums for accountability and public oversight, a change underscored by a newfound respect from neighbors who had quietly observed the conflict from their porches or across yards. Personally, the experience reshaped my perspective on property rights, civic responsibility, and the importance of meticulous preparation in the face of bureaucratic overreach, as I found myself documenting every correspondence, every notice, and every rule with unprecedented care, not out of paranoia, but out of a clear understanding that vigilance is the only defense against abuse, and I became an unofficial advisor to those in the community who feared they might be next, walking them through evidence collection, legal recourse, and the emotional resilience required to face an organization willing to weaponize paperwork against ordinary homeowners. And while the financial relief was significant, invalidated fines, return of wrongful fees, and prevention of future claims, the emotional payoff was immeasurable, a quiet triumph that came not from revenge, but from the restoration of fairness and the empowerment of ordinary residents. Over time, the HOA itself underwent a dramatic restructuring, with board members resigning, new leadership elected, and a complete overhaul of bylaws and fee structures implemented under the watchful eye of legal counsel, creating a model for transparency and accountability that neighbors could finally trust. And as the community began to heal, the lingering fear of arbitrary punishment gradually gave way to collaboration, mutual respect, and a collective sense that power must always be checked, for authority without accountability inevitably becomes tyranny. Reflecting on the ordeal, I realized that the personal stakes, the sleepless nights, the anxiety, the meticulous planning and confrontation, were all part of a larger lesson about courage and preparedness, about the importance of standing firm when wronged, and about the profound difference one determined individual can make in shifting the balance of power and restoring justice. And as I walked through the now peaceful streets of my neighborhood, the weight of the past months pressing lightly on my shoulders, I understood that the ultimate victory was not just in the court rulings or the voided fees, but in the awakening of a community to its own agency, in the knowledge that rules and authority are not invincible, and in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the truth, once wielded correctly, can dismantle even the most entrenched structures of intimidation. And as neighbors shared stories of how they had begun to question previously unquestioned mandates, how they had felt empowered to attend meetings, voice concerns, and demand accountability, I saw the long-term consequences of what had seemed, in the moment, like a personal battle. A community transformed, vigilance normalized, and a culture of transparency and justice instilled where fear had once reigned, leaving me with a powerful takeaway that resonates beyond our streets, beyond our HOA walls, into any corner where authority is abused. Courage, preparation, and unwavering commitment to the truth can topple even the most formidable of bullies, and while the scars of conflict may remain, the legacy of standing up, of refusing to be silenced, ensures that fairness endures, and that the lessons of one fight can empower countless others to reclaim their rights. Ask the hard questions, and never accept intimidation as the final word, reminding me, and anyone who witnesses this story, that justice is not always immediate, but it is attainable when met with persistence, evidence, and the refusal to yield. And as I close this chapter, the lingering question persists, quietly echoing in the minds of all who were watching: will others continue to let fear dictate their lives, or will they, too, rise and demand the accountability that every community deserves?